Hey, third grade friends, it's Mrs. Miller again. Today we're going to listen to Lesson 8 about Henry Hudson. Don't forget, you can pause your video to catch up on notes, and you can go back and listen again if you missed something. Here we go. Your materials you need for today are a pencil, something to write with, and the graphic organizer that you see here about Henry Hudson. Remember, you can find this in your work packet or on your Google Classroom. Here's some things we need to know about Henry Hudson. First, Hudson also wanted to find a northwest passage to the Indies. Second, Hudson made his first voyage more than 100 years after Cabot. Third, Hudson's idea was to sail over the North Pole and down to Asia. Henry Hudson has a river, a strait, and a bay named after him to this very day. Here's your purpose for listening. Listen carefully to hear about Henry Hudson's discoveries and his expeditions. John Cabot was not the only person who was eager to find a northwest passage to the Indies. English explorer Henry Hudson had the same goal. Very little is known about Henry Hudson's early life, but we do know he had an interest in exploring Arctic geography. Hudson made his first attempt to find the Northwest Passage in 1607, more than 100 years after Cabot made his voyages. Hudson's idea about how he might get to the Indies was similar to Cabot's. Hudson's idea was to sail north, right over the North Pole. He knew the polar region was cold and icy, but he also knew that the sun never set during the summer months. He thought that the summer sun might melt a lot of the ice, making it possible to sail over the top of the earth and come out on the other side of the world in Asia. In May of 1607, Hudson embarked from England with a single ship called the Hopewell. 6 weeks later, in the middle of June, his men sighted the eastern coast of Greenland. Hudson sailed along the eastern coast of Greenland. Then he turned and sailed northeast. He would have headed due north, but ice prevented him. Over the course of their voyage, he and his men saw many unfamiliar creatures, including whales, seals, and walruses. In mid-July, they reached the Spitzbergen Archipelago, which is a chain of islands that has an Arctic climate. When Hudson tried to navigate this region, it was surrounded by pack ice and frozen seawater. On May 16th, Hudson's ship almost got stuck in the ice, and for a while it was kind of touch and go. That means that someone's in a dangerous or unpredictable situation. A few days later, Hudson decided he could not reach the North Pole because of all the ice, and he turned around and sailed back to England. If we look at our notes on Henry Hudson, we'll notice that it has a place for route, his motivating factors, and then his voyages. Let's start with his route. So Hudson's idea was similar to Cabot's. He was using those ideas of latitude and longitude, except he was kind of thinking of the other direction that Cabot was. Cabot was looking around the circumference of the Earth, like a basketball, and Hudson was thinking more around the Earth from over the top through the North Pole. So for our route for Hudson, we're going to say Arctic region over the North Pole. He thought that the ice would melt enough that he could get through and come out the other side. Now, Hudson's motivating factors are a little different. The first one isn't. He, just like Columbus and Cabot, wanted to find a shorter route to the East Indies. Back then, kind of everybody wanted to find that shorter route. So we're going to put that as his first motivating factor. Shorter route to East Indies. But another motivating factor for Cabot was it said that he had an interest in exploring Arctic geography, which means kind of the landscape and the land of the Arctic. He was interested in that area. That's not a motivating factor that Columbus or Cabot had. So we're going to say interest in Arctic geography. Oops, I spelled Arctic wrong. There we go. And we'll say in parentheses, that's the land, that area. Okay, we already heard about his first voyage. So let's take notes about that before we hear about the other one. It was in May of 1607, so we'll just put the year, 1607. And he sailed from England, so we're going to say from England, in one ship called the Hopewell. Now it says here that in the middle of June, his men sighted the eastern coast of Greenland, and he sailed along that eastern coast. He would have kept going north, but the ice prevented him from going any farther. He did see a lot of creatures that they hadn't seen before, things they don't have in England, like whales and seals and walruses. But because he was kind of stuck in the ice, or almost stuck in the ice, he had to turn around to go back to England because he figured out he couldn't reach the North Pole going that direction because there was too much ice. So let's sum all that up and put it into our notes. So we have from England in one ship called the Hopewell. We're going to add a comma here and say sailed along the eastern coast of Greenland. Eastern coast of Greenland, comma. And we'll just say that he had to turn back to England because of heavy ice in his path. In 1608, Hudson made a second attempt to reach the East Indies by sailing the Hopewell across the North Pole. He sailed north of Scandinavia and Russia. He sailed more than 2,500 miles, making it to the islands off the coast of Russia, known as Novaya Zemlya, New Land. But there was so much ice in the water that he had to turn back. In 1609, Hudson made a third attempt to find the Northwest Passage. This time he sailed for the Dutch under the Dutch East India Company. The Dutch East India Company was a trading company that formed to protect their trade in the East Indies. The company hired Hudson and gave him very specific instructions. He was to follow a similar route he had attempted on his previous voyage, sailing north of Scandinavia and Russia. The hope, as before, was that he would be able to sail over the top of the earth and emerge in Asia. Hudson left Amsterdam, the Netherlands, in April of 1609, on board the Dutch ship the Half Moon. As he made his way north, he saw more and more ice. Eventually, there was so much ice that Hudson decided to give up and turn around in mid-May. Instead of sailing back to Amsterdam, as he had been told to do, Hudson boldly decided to sail west. Hudson sailed across the Atlantic and sighted Newfoundland on July 12th. He sailed along the coast of North America, exploring much of what is now the east coast of the United States. He and his men sailed as far south as Virginia, where the Jamestown settlement had recently been established. Then they turned north. On September 3rd, they came upon a large river that emptied into the Atlantic. Hudson and his men explored the river, sailing upstream. When Hudson saw the river widening out, he thought it might be a passage that would lead all the way through North America. He thought the river he was exploring might be that Northwest Passage that he and explorers before him had been seeking for years. Farther upstream, the river narrowed, and Hudson began to think, maybe it would not lead him through the continent. Nevertheless, it was an interesting discovery. Hudson claimed the area for the Netherlands and the Dutch. Back to our notes. We now know about Hudson's second and third voyage, so let's fill those in. In our second box, we're going to start with Hudson's second voyage, which took place 1 year after the first one. So 1608. In this voyage, Hudson also sailed the Hopewell and tried to sail across the North Pole. This time he took a slightly different route, and he sailed north of Scandinavia and Russia, but he still had to turn back because there was just too much ice in the water. So we're going to say Hopewell again, because that's the ship he used, sailed north of Scandinavia and Russia, comma, had to turn back because there was too much ice. Hudson's third voyage was the next year, so in 1609. This time, Hudson wasn't sailing from England or for England. He was sponsored by somebody called the Dutch East India Company. This was a trading company. So we're going to say sailed for Dutch East India Trading Company, comma. Now, they gave him very specific instructions. They said, follow this route, see if you can go over the top of the earth and come down in Asia, which he did. But then they wanted him to return home, of course, if he couldn't do that, which he didn't. So we have sailed for Dutch East India Trading Company. We're going to say sailed north and came upon ice again. Turned back, but did not return home. So let's add a little bit more here, because this is an important voyage for Hudson. So instead of returning home, he has this ship from the Dutch East India Company called the Half Moon. And he sails that actually down across the Atlantic, over to Newfoundland, and then down the east coast of the United States. So let's say he sailed the Half Moon, that's the name of the ship, across the Atlantic and down the east or eastern coast of the U.S. While he was on the eastern coast of the U.S., he came across this river that he started exploring, which was a massive river. So he thought, hey, maybe this is a passage. Maybe it goes all the way through this land and comes out in Asia. As he's sailing on it, though, and it's getting narrower and narrower, he's realizing it's probably not. But at this point, he's pretty deep into the U.S. So let's add that part. Discovered a river he thought might be the Northwest, we'll abbreviate it NW, Passage, and explored. Hudson and his crew encountered many Native Americans of the Algonquin-speaking tribes on their trip up the river. Some Native Americans tried to attack them, whereas others visited the ship to trade. The Indians offered furs to Hudson in trade, and this started the fur trade along the Hudson River. One group invited Hudson to dinner. Later, Hudson described what he had experienced in his journal. I sailed to the shore in one of their canoes with an old man who was the chief of a tribe consisting of 40 men and 17 women. These I saw there in a house well constructed of oak bark and circular in shape, so that it had the appearance of being built with an arched roof. It contained a great quantity of maize or Indian corn, and beans of the last year's growth, and there lay near the house, for the purpose of drying, enough to load 3 ships, besides what was growing in the fields. On our coming into the house, 2 mats were spread out to sit upon, and some food was immediately served in well-made red wooden bowls. 2 men brought in a pair of pigeons which they had shot. They supposed I would remain with them for the night, but I returned after a short time on board the ship. The land is the finest for cultivation that I ever in my life set foot upon, and it also abounds in trees of every description. These natives are a very good people, for when they saw that I would not remain, they supposed that I was afraid of their bows, and, taking their arrows, they broke them in pieces and threw them into the fire. In late September, Hudson decided to sail back to Europe. He himself wanted to stay in the New World for the winter, but his men were tired of exploring, and they were threatening to mutiny. The river Hudson discovered on his 3rd voyage was later named after him. Even today it is known as the Hudson River. Other Dutchmen came to this part of the world after Hudson. They built a city at the mouth of the Hudson River, on an island the Indians called Mannahatta. The Dutch called this city New Amsterdam, and later its name was changed to New York. Today, Manhattan is the name of one of those parts of New York City, and New York City is the most populous city in the United States. Let's finish up our notes on Hudson's 3rd voyage. So he's up this river, he's met the Algonquin people. He has now claimed this land for the Netherlands and the Dutch. So let's say claimed land for Netherlands and the Dutch. And he's also found some peaceful Algonquin-speaking tribes there that he is trading with. And in trade, they're offering furs to Hudson, which started something called the fur trade, which is something pretty big in history that you'll learn more about later. But we do want to include that here. So we want to say maybe the beginning of the fur trade was with Hudson and the Algonquin people. The river that Hudson was sailing up, that's still called the Hudson River to this day. So let's add Hudson River to his list of the 3rd voyage. And there is that city there that the Indians called Mannahatta, and today we call Manhattan, which is in New York City. So we want to also, let's put Manhattan, New York City. That would be present day, of course, but Hudson did discover that part of that land. In 1610, Hudson set off on a 4th voyage. This time he was sponsored by 2 English companies, the Virginia Company and the British East India Company. Similar to the Dutch East India Company, these companies were also trading companies. Hudson's goal was the same, to find a Northwest Passage, a water route that would lead through the American continent and allow ships to sail to Asia. Hudson sailed west, but he stayed far to the north. He reached Greenland in early June. A few weeks later, he and his men found a large strait that led into the center of North America. Hudson hoped it might lead all the way through to Asia. On August 2nd, Hudson sailed out of the strait and into a large bay. Today, this bay is known as the Hudson Bay, and the strait is known as the Hudson Strait. Hudson spent the next few months exploring the coast of the bay. In November, his ship got stuck in the ice. He and his crew had to go ashore for the winter. It was a difficult, freezing cold winter. The men were fighting with Hudson, as well as with one another. Several of them fell ill with scurvy, a disease that preys on people who have not been eating a healthy, balanced diet. When spring came, Hudson wanted to explore some more. Most of the men on the ship wanted to sail back to England. a big fight broke out. In the end, the sailors mutinied. That means they overthrew Hudson. They put Hudson, his son, and some others they did not like in a small open boat and sailed away. Henry Hudson, the great explorer, was never heard from again. We're going to round off our notes by finishing Hudson's fourth voyage. So we're going to go down to our next box. And this voyage took place in 1610. This time Hudson sailed for 2 companies, not just one. So let's say he sailed for, and then we'll list them. The Virginia Company was one, and the British East India Company. Both of these were trading companies, just like the Dutch East India Company. So let's put that in parentheses. Trading companies. They had an interest in that fur trade we talked about earlier. So Hudson's motivating factor is still the same. He's still trying to find a shorter route, that Northwest Passage, somewhere through the American continent, he thinks. So this time when he went back, he sailed through a strait that came out into a bay. Both of those are named after him still to this day. So we're going to say sailed along Greenland into Hudson Strait, AIT for strait, and Hudson Bay. Here he spent a few months exploring, but again got stuck in the ice. It was a horrible, freezing cold, difficult winter. His crew had had enough. They wanted to go back to England, even though he wanted to stay. So they mutinied. They overthrew him. They left him and his son and some other of his crew members there, sailed back to England, and we never heard from Henry Hudson again. So for our final note, let's say Hudson's crew mutinied. We can say it took over in parentheses. The ship and sailed back to England, leaving Hudson, his son, and some other crew members behind. And finally, we'll say Hudson was never heard from again. Kind of a sad story to this great explorer.